Also, a thank you for inviting me to present here. It is flattering and daunting, particularly now coming after the paper of Shohini. That was wonderful. And I hope to make my paper worth your while, even as I come with the requisite apologies that this is not merely a work in progress. It is a paper intended to kickstart research I've just keep sitting on, and perhaps a few additional apologies to other presenters of some panels I've attended, especially to do with benefit stigma and poverty, because if I were truly clever, I could weave in responses into the paper as I went along. But I am thinking about you. This paper offers an overview in which I articulate some key issues around the representation of finance and global capitalism, looking at strategies that illustrate these systems as threats to human rights, to the integrity and dignity of human life. And one issue I'll also return to more than a few times is hybridity and the work it can do in this regard. For a while, I've been interested in the ways that films envision human economic rights, presenting conditions of capitalism and poverty as violations. This is not only about the attention to the conditions brought on by neoliberalism and financial crises, but thinking about a shift in the discourse from poverty to misfortune or personal failing, remedied by charitable giving, to systemic harm requiring shifts in politics. It is about recognizing that such systems, markets for instance, are not autonomous, rational, and neutral operations, but coming out of processes of human interactions. Poverty then is not simply an unfortunate state of being or accidental byproduct. Rather, it is the result of impoverishment, actions taken that threaten human safety and security. And rights offer a language of politics and violation that center human well-being, and this centering, I believe, has its uses in combating the rational claims of neoliberalism and global capitalism and its actors, as well as the moralizing discourses around poverty. And now I'll just also briefly apologize to non-human formations that I am neglecting in this presentation. The persistence of this discourse in film has done a great deal to combat what Laura Basu sees as the media amnesia of popular reportage. This is, as she explains, the continual reframing of crisis in media that both forgets and maintains the conditions that have led to the situations reported. This crisis narrative renders the situation a constant surprise and contributes to the conviction that what is happening is challenging, just too challenging to grasp. And this is not helped by the industrial context of journalism beset by staffing cuts and churnalism, both of which, among other things, impede long-form, in-depth reportage. And in this way, films can help. They can intervene in the long-form mapping of the transnational and transhistorical workings of capital. These films work not, to make visible those systems that are otherwise treated, as I've mentioned, as abstract, as neutral, autonomous, too hard to understand, and ultimately somehow removed from our lived experience, that they would happen on their own even if we weren't there. These films not only envision financial systems, but they also present human life as enmeshed in these systems, allowing the relationships between the workings of finance and the possibilities of violation to come to the fore. And this isn't new, but perhaps there could be some reflection on what it means to bring these together in a category, to see the longer form narratives and mappings across decades of film. This can include the Latin American political films of the 60s and 70s, and indeed many of the films of decolonization that outlined the dependency of the first world on the third and capitalism on the people. And there are the films and media of alter-globalization movements and WTO protests, which harnessed internet circuits and aesthetics for the development of collective counter-narratives and connections. Consider indie media, the open publishing network of journalist and documentary collectives for global reporting. And of course, one cannot forget the ways the Zapatistas deployed the early internet circuits for global mobilization. There's also, as we can see here too, the many responses to the 2008 financial crisis, from documentary representations of credit default swap systems to the Occupy movements worldwide. And throughout, but ramping up at the turn of the millennium, have been the documentaries preoccupied with debt and structural adjustment programs, trade and labor, all pointing to the ways systems of global capitalism, informed by neoliberalism, contribute to and maintain poverty and inflict harm. And even as some might support development goals, many question the benefits. And my approach to these has been couched in a broader context of human rights. That is, how are these making the case in ways that invoked economic rights legally, that is, making them actionable under possibly existing law, or referencing at least the conventions, the UN conventions? How were they doing so conceptually to shift the discourse? And how are they doing so affectively to promote visceral or outraged response? And there have been a set of challenges facing this envisioning of economic rights. One is to overcome a discourse that has minimized the discussion of economic and social rights when compared to the recognition of political and civil rights. Discourses around poverty, debt, and minimal access to shelter, medicine, labor, and education, they have not always, been couched as problems of violations of rights to these things. Instead, these problems have been presented as moral failings, misfortune, and maybe at best the effects of a crisis, as something gone wrong, and not systemic violations of something, of a system working exactly as intended. Consider, for instance, the idea of people borrowing beyond their means versus predatory lending practices were in operation. However, the past decade has seen a rise in this, in the rise of social and economic justice. But even if to render these actions as systemic violations, how? How to make visible circuits and processes that are largely unseen and abstract, that people treat as neutral, as rational? And how can the connections be drawn in ways that make them evident and urgent? Political and civil rights have the benefit, however questionable, of the body, of the victim-perpetrator paradigm, but how can this be translated, adapted, or reinvented for economic justice? Or how can film develop a new language for showing what's taking place and highlighting the actions and policies as a form of rights violation? And of course, rights as a discourse has its limits. There is its reliance on the abjection of the human body, one divested of its agency and dignity. There are associations, even within the rights discourse, of a neoliberal logic that advances the individual over the collective, that justifies development initiatives of the global north, and that has bolstered many of the channels through which these media travel. These limits of rights discourse may be tested and expanded through an exploration of economic rights on film. And I'm tempted to ruminate on these a bit. The potential is particularly for agency and solidarity, but I'd like to discuss the rhetorical strategies now, the elements of content and form that make the case for economic rights, and the ways in which the current financial systems can violate them. One tactic is to link to political and civil rights, which has three things going for it. These are more prominent in the historical and political imaginary. These tend to be the sets of rights, that are more recognized. These refer to torture, unlawful imprisonment, among other things. There is an explicit bodily component that makes the harm and the relationship between the victim and the perpetrator more evident. And there is a familiar rhetorical and iconographic grid for recognizing the claims, again, however problematic. Consider how images of the Holocaust can be circulated or used for comparison to make a case for genocide. The iconographic library of past horrors can provide a resource for articulating the weight of others. And Stephanie Black provides such rhetorical connection in two documentaries. H2 Worker looks at the H2 visa guest worker program in the US, aligning this importation of labor with limited rights and access to the space, access to the space they inhabit, with slavery and its enduring legacy. And Life and Debt outlines the lived effects of structural adjustment programs, which through debt maintains the colonial violence of the past through extraction of resources, human and otherwise, as forms of repayment of that debt. The images she chooses highlight the physical menace of these circumstances, such as in the sequence on free trade zones, and oh dear, okay, here we go, which manage their human border crossings through policing, prison-like mazes and barbed wires. That the trade is free, but the humans are not. Indeed, both films look at the paradoxical relationship of accelerated mobilities of capital with the increased confinement of people. Bamako employs tactics of documentary and genre fiction to engage these conceptual and affective links. The bulk of the action takes place in a Malian courtyard in the title city, where the World Bank is on trial for crimes against humanity. This depicted action seems to be drawn from, or at least linked to, the 2006 World Social Forum held in Bamako, resulting in an appeal that sought to construct political, economic, and cultural consensus and solidarity against neoliberal globalization and, quote, the dictatorship of foreign markets. The language of the appeal and the language of the testimonies in the film, semi-improvised and seeming to reference the appeal, both of these draw on the language of violence with political associations. They argue contemporary financial relationships between the first and third world, reenact the colonial violence and slavery of the past. And a gesture to genre also secures this link. Midway through the film, the locals watch a Western on television. This is a film within a film called Death in Timbuktu, and it features, among others, Palestinian director Elias Suleiman, American actor Danny Glover, and Sissoko himself. Cowboys enter a Malian town. It is not clear who is bad or who is good. The costumes of black and white here mean nothing, nor does the casting. The editing, too, refuses a stable sense of place and relationship among the figures. What is clear, however, is the violence, as bullets fly and the townspeople are the ones most threatened. But the killing isn't entirely random, as it seems to operate by some logic suggested when one of the cowboys kills a man because they already have two school teachers. That's too, there's too many. So it becomes a bloody rationalization that highlights market logics and violence. And it has a place in a genre associated with colonial expansion, technological development, and genocide, even as the confounding landscape and myriad players speak to an updated and global context. In addition to and through these tropes associated with political rights and violations, the improvised and reenacted trial in the courtyard and the Western segment, through these, Bamako employs hybridity, which operates persistently in these films of economic rights. Now, I should say documentary logics are often used in many films to present a case. That is, there is a reliance on the authority of exposition and its command over the visual realm, ensuring a parallel economy of sound and image to make its case. Consider, for instance, the sort of well-intentioned PowerPoint of Charles Ferguson's Inside Job, which highlights the criminality of the system through narration and illustration. And Alex Gibney's films, Park Avenue and Enron, The Smartest Guys in the Room, follow suit with rational cases provided to explain the radical disparity and financial crimes that have brought on harm. But perhaps more interesting have been the films that are disrupting this information economy and its attendant authority through experimentation and hybridity. Now, the appeal of hybridity for this topic probably comes as little surprise. Hybridity is the totem of globalization, after all, rife with complexities and contradictions as dynamic flows of capital, technology, people, and media result in disjuncture and deterritorialization, as well as intersections and reterritorialization. Decades on, Arjun Appadurai's territorial metaphor of scapes, continues to provide a productive way of conceiving of these these dimensions and dynamics of these movements, overlapping and irregular. That is, even when trade barriers are lifted, human flows are constrained by rigid national border enforcement, by detention centers, by circumstances that have made labor and capital and commodities exportable whilst bodies are not. Still, a celebratory discourse can hew to hybridity, it often does, one that revels in the cultural mixtures emerging from the encounters and collisions with globalization. Hybridity illustrates the intersections and overlaps of culture, ideas, and identities, but it can also illustrate the otherwise invisible flows of finance and labor and their effects. And this is useful, I would say, in a context where so often we do focus on flows of people, for better or worse, that it's important to attend to migration, but so often this attention symbolically locates the threats in people and then justifies border enforcements and confinement, while giving less attention to perhaps the ways in which capital and its agents travel freely. And this hybridity may come through genre play that forges either allegory or modal instability, the uncertain space of fiction and documentary that cultivates unease and uncanniness. And this may be the site of new and disturbing subject formations, which I'll discuss a bit further on. And it can also be a site for disruption as it unsettles the economies of the narrative or the information delivery. For instance, there is Giorgi Furtado's 1989 film, Island of Flowers, a short animated documentary that presents global capitalism in the tracing of a tomato from farm to rubbish dump. The ever-accelerating narration and its breathless comic efforts at detail offer a burlesque of scientific exposition, the excess of the subject overwhelming the rational effort of precision and management. The animation supplies illustrations for the words, occasionally undercutting them through the fastidious of equivalence. A whale and a chicken will be brought together, however comic the effect, and occasionally undermining through iconographic choices such as an atom bomb explosion, concluding a narrative about exchange, or Holocaust liberation footage being used in the identification of humans. Because with these images that follow narrations about money and exchange, they mount a causality that links finance to violation. The liberal economy and the documentary economy are aligned and disrupted simultaneously as the violence of capitalism on the body is illustrated. Another more recent film, Jean-Stéphane Brun's post-crisis Cleveland versus Wall Street, enacts a trial for the cameras in which a community holds financial institutions responsible for the ruinous effects of the subprime mortgage crisis. This performance piece, a real documentary of a fake trial over a real grievance, featuring real players, that is, representatives of the banks, representatives of the communities, lawyers, and Senate jury selected. These all provide a means of conceptualizing the complications of a financial system that inhabits a gray zone of legality, and it disrupts the acceptance of a top-down model of argumentation that encourages gullibility over protest. Through this hybridity and reflexivity, such films challenge not only the authority of the documentary, but also the ingrained conviction in the neutrality of finance. And I don't know if here is the place to flag up what this might mean in today's context of post-truth and, skepticism of experts. I've been thinking about this, but yeah, this is something that's been coming up as I go through these works. But meanwhile, these intersecting scapes illustrate not only the contact zones of various flows, but also the subject formations that take place at the sites of this overlap. This is where the material effects of these abstract flows come to the fore, where the body and its violation can be illustrated. And in particular, it helps to understand labor as one of these flows or scapes, to give it a mobile and spatial presence. After all, through the assistance of technology and finance and media, labor travels whilst people stay within borders, behind factory walls and cubicle particle board. These spaces can be the free trade zones I mentioned. They can be the factories that export goods produced at lower cost and without safety oversights. They can be the maquiladoras, those foreign-owned factories that set up shop in a nation to take advantage of lower cost labor. They can even be call centers. These are the contact zones of interpenetrating flows of capital and technology and media and labor. And hybridity helps to illustrate not only the dimensions and operations of such contact zones, but the new subjectivities formed in these spaces. And perhaps most potently, this hybridity challenges the celebratory meta-narrative of evolutionary biology, presenting instead the body horror that emerges in these virtual worlds and interpenetrations. And my language takes a science fiction turn, and not just because science fiction does offer one of the key genres for political exploration. It is an excellent genre for thinking about remote labor as facilitated through technology. Alex Rivera demonstrates this in both his short mockumentary Why Cyberceros and his longer science fiction narrative Sleep Dealer. Both films feature the use of drones to work on one side of the border as humans operate them from the other. All of the labor with none of the people, a narrator jokingly promises in the mock promotional film, which offers a digital update to the actual Braceros guest worker program and refers to, in some ways, what is happening with call centers. Now, science fiction informs John and Jane Toll-Free, which introduces us to 6 call center workers and the cultural dislocations they experience as virtual migrants. These dislocations are multiple in form. Working according to the time zones of the United States, they are temporarily dislocated from India. The characters sleep during the day and they work at night. The office space is organized accordingly, with sections ordered according to the different time zones of the United States, allowing a hybrid mapping of space with overlapping times and geographies. And there is also a material and physical sensibility to this dislocation, underscored in the uneven development of their environment. Characters move between deindustrialized and industrialized spaces, traveling from buildings in disrepair, open-air markets and dusty lots, to buildings and office parks of steel and glass modeled on North American architecture. The migrations are daily and constant. The call centers where they work also house sites of industrialized leisure like McDonald's, video arcades, and shopping malls where they can buy Puma and Nike products. And so in this way, we can think of the workers as moving between India and the US, between home and work and leisure, in these contact zones of constant, mergers and dislocations. And as is evident in the title, the call center workers take American names as part of their job. Their own names aren't even, and I guess you can't see it here, but they're not even present on their ID cards, which note only employee numbers and blood types. In addition to American names, the workers receive training in American accents, trivia, and communication style, so as to refigure their subjectivities as they navigate the virtual encounter. This training also bleeds into their waking or non-working sensibilities. The film shows many of the workers spending the bulk of their leisure time in the office park, going on romantic dates even. In fact, the marriages forged in the crucible of call centers end up being one of the topics in this film. In his off time, one of the characters, the ambitious Osmond, sells Amway products. Amway is an American company specializing in multi-level marketing. And the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Naomi, whom we see there, lives within her American accent and her American name, indulging a fantasy of successful transformation She tells us often that she delights in people asking her where she is from, claiming to be mistaken for an American, even as the bleaching of her hair and skin seems both evident and painful even. She is sort of the embodiment of immersion and dislocation. She is the mixture of the human she once was and the technologies of culture and finance and labor that have taken root in her home and in her body. She is one of the new hybrid species to emerge in this contact zone, and she is then the embodiment of the penetration of these flows. And the science fiction of this film extends beyond these sort of this suggestion of a hybrid formation. Sonically, there is the favored trope of the genre, the electronica soundtrack. The sound effects highlight technology, voices are tinny and hollow, highlighting the circuitry through which we virtually travel. This may sound obvious, but this choice allows for a representation of unseen pathways that cross over with the seen as well as the embodied alterations. Meanwhile, the mixed mode interrupts the documentary information economy that might otherwise, be another piece of seemingly transparent or neutral circuitry. It too is enmeshed in the flows that form these new and disturbing subjectivities. And despite my somewhat older selection of films as example, these themes persist and seem to be gaining currency today with the growth of anti-capitalist movements. One of my favorites of these films, and one that resonates with John and Jane, is Boots Riley's Sorry to Bother You. In its story of call center worker Cash Green, this comic speculative fiction makes vivid the intersections of race, slavery, and corporate operations in the United States. Its fantastic excesses are not really quite so radical as might immediately seem. Worry Free, a subsidiary of the company for which Cash works, buys debt and gives ostensibly free shelter and accommodation to its subjects who work off their debt. And we can see them in the corner here, as the carceral imagery gestures not only to a form of enslavement, but to the ways in which slavery has been perpetuated in the U.S. through disproportionate incarceration of African Americans, who then provide labor for the state through convict leasing programs. And still, the multiracial makeup of Worry Free's subjects speak to a broader context, one of the impoverishing actions of capitalism. This is not so different, again, from the structural adjustment programs that produce debt bondage for post-colonial nations. And again, I bring up Life and Debt, nor in its iconography is it that different from the conditions of workers in factories in many of these films, particularly depicted in such factory films as A Decent Factory or China Blue, which is set in a blue jeans factory, where there is a sort of carceral imaginary shaping their day-to-day work lives, even as these are documentaries. The navigation of space and temporalities and subjectivity through both virtual migration and labor is rendered vividly. It is through editing that Cash's labor time and leisure time allied. For instance, one reaction shot allows for a transition from a work to a bar with friends. Cash plummets into homes when making his phone calls. As we see here, a sudden and shocking drop into another world each time. There is a comic effect, to be sure, but these moments emphasize the easy penetrations of lived space. But the smooth transitions enabled by capital and technology do not mitigate the uneven development of the United States, such as in the scene down below, this sort of very low-tech form of advertising signs, which stands out in a world where so many of the encounters that they experience are mediated through technology. In some ways, we have screens, for screens there. And the calls, Yeah, it's a world where the worry-free adverts, entertainment, news, everything, we keep seeing them on television sets shown on screen. And the call center itself embodies this uneven development, as the bottom floor is cluttered with papers, objects, and people wearing headsets, whilst upstairs is a site of spatial privilege. It isn't, highly populated, there's wireless connectivity, and champagne celebrations for sales. And the things they're sailing are global arms and debt and so on. So we've got that. And then Sorry to Bother You, like John and Jane, is preoccupied with the forging of subjectivities as at the crossroads of these uneven flows. Here, however, Cash is not schooled in American trivia, but rather encouraged to speak in a white voice, which is then realized through the dubbing of a white actor. It is with this performance, one that literalizes the theories of double consciousness from W.E.B. Du Bois to Frantz Fanon and Paul Gilroy, that Cash succeeds and rises through the ranks. At the same time, even this voice does not stay at work, but slips out in leisure time, much to the chagrin of his friends and his girlfriend. It is not a containable practice, but a transformative and destructive and dislocating experience. And if not already suggestive in that, Riley takes this further with the proposed hybrid formation of the ultimate worker, the Equisapiens, pictured there in the corner in a short company video shown to Cash. Here is the literalization, with the merger of man and horse, the literalization of a dehumanized subjectivity of the laborers in this economy. That this nonfiction film within the film is animated works to denature the logics, again, and rationalizations of this tool of corporate communication. To choose animation rather than to enact this takes up this kind of language and undermines it. Now, I've only just started to sort of give you a sort of surface overview both of this film and of the many films that represent the ways in which we can think about the violations of particular financial systems. Similarly, I've only started to unpick the function of hybridity in the films, whereby it helps illustrate the flows and systems of capital and its effects on the human subject, and also to think about the ways in which hybridity can be used to challenge the operative rationalizations and claims to objectivity and neutrality that can exist narratively through documentary logic and through economic logics. So, thank you. I'll just